looking for a place where history gets mugged and beaten up, try a visit to the cinema, whether it's Errol Flynn as Robin Hood, Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra, or even Sean Connery as King Arthur. You can be sure that the cinema version of history gives us a misleading idea of people, places, and events in the past. One problem of history on film is that we get caught up in directors' visions of how they'd like the past to look. Never mind the evidence, let's sweep the audience into the fantasy. Thousands of extras, bigger battles, spectacular locations. Complete make-believe. If you want history, what's wrong with a good old ancient monument? Now this seems to provide us with some real evidence of the past. It's part of the Roman city of Wroxeter near Shrewsbury, one of the largest towns built by the Romans here in Britain. This is the heart of it, a place for business, trade and leisure. And these are the remains of huge public buildings which once dominated this whole area. But the more you look, the more the confusion. So much detail has gone. So what's the truth? At least there's enough solid evidence here for us to have a go at some reconstruction drawings. Of course, there's no single or correct way of working out how a building like this Roman bathhouse looked when it was in full use 2,000 years ago. It's a series of guesses, opinions, which have the habit of becoming accepted as truth if they're heard often enough. Until, that is, someone comes along with a fresh interpretation based on some newly discovered evidence. Then it's all in the air. But then there always have been lots of versions of history buzzing around at the same time. I mean, chances are that the next generation of historians, learning about history in more practical ways, sifting a greater range of evidence, will come up with fresh insights.
The 4th century, the bars and the basilica were beginning to become rather decrepit.
But until they form new theories and ideas of their own, the rest of us will have to take history when and where we can find it.
This, of course, fits in with the rest of what we think of Roman Britain. By the beginning of the 5th century, AD 410, the Roman army and the civil servants were moving.
Now here's a sort of expert, someone who really knows what he's talking about. Because he's an official guide, we accept what he says about the site. It's probably the truth. Well, not necessarily. He's only as good as the stories he's heard or from what he's read about Wroxeter. What we really need is some proper written down evidence from an authentic source. And where better to find original documentation than in an archive? With open access for truth seekers at all reasonable hours, archives are favourite haunts for history detectives and hoarders alike. But where in the myriad collections of ancient maps, bundled papers and computerised databases can we find the grains of historical truth? Are we reading about what really happened? And should we believe those accounts of the past captured and recorded in oral history? Or is everything that's stored and preserved for us to study just someone's opinion riddled with falsehood? The authenticity of documents like these is not in doubt. Good evidence that takes us closer towards the truth, or so you might think. But then again, the more research you do, the more you'll find. A journalist's report in a newspaper will be very different from a personal entry in a diary of the same event. So, who can you believe? The wisest counsel is in not expecting to believe one single voice or set of opinions. Authors and documenters tend to be partial in what they write and investigate, and by no means everyone who has important things to say gets published. So history has plenty of hurdles to leap before appearing in print and on sale to us. By the time the past gets to the present and appears in the books on these shelves, it's been reworked so many times it's probably become even more fictional. Designers and illustrators bring their own contemporary styles to the work they do, and like the guide at Roxeter, work to the evidence which authors and researchers give them.
18, railway Terence, with his mother,
And nowhere is this potential for corrupting the past better realised than in the books written for children. Not that it's a bad way to introduce history. Talking about the past is a powerful means of sparking interest. But all the same, what we say and read to them is just one episode in dealing with the evidence.
Large wheels there, one hood, and you get two babies, so one of them's going to get very wet. Look at the steamship as well.
The text and pictures in a new book like this present a completely different view of the past from books given to me at school in the 1950s. So where would I find evidence which is constant and unchanging? If not in films, in stories, or in what's written down, could I find it in objects and in places where the past is faithfully and carefully preserved? How about in the things tucked away in museum land? Which of us has not at some time cruised the corridors or drifted among the display cases? What is it that makes museums so appealing? Perhaps they bring out the hoarder and collector in us. You know, that bit that can't bear to throw old things away. Well, whatever it is, I'm afraid I'm a museum addict. As an adult, wandering past the bits and pieces that have made it down the centuries, or stumbling across objects you recognise and understand, means you can't avoid snap connections to the past. But if you're a young visitor, perhaps for the very first time in a museum, what's the memory you'll take away with you? A genuine interpretation, or a confused jumble of the past? Too many things from too many periods. And in any case, can objects ever make any historical sense unless you see them in a full-scale reconstruction? In one way, a handsomely preserved city like York is a full-scale historical reconstruction in itself. The medieval lanes, the close-packed houses, the picturesque shops. But walking the streets, you can sometimes feel more part of a storybook than in touch with any historical reality. Until, that is, you meet up with Jorvik, a careful reconstruction of an ancient Viking settlement. The excitement of reconstructions like Jorvik here is that you really do feel like a time traveller. For a few magical minutes, swept back 1,000 years to the people, noise, even the smells of Viking York. But the thing is, can you really believe what you see? I just can't help feeling that I've tumbled into one of those present-day weekend historical fairs. You know, the ones with a Y in fair. Is this actually how it was? And did Viking settlers really look like that? The truth at last? But to be fair, because all this is based on excavated evidence, it's a pretty good guess about how people lived. Leather stuff, for example, shoes, belts, this money bag, are all replicas of things which archaeologists have actually dug up. This reconstruction is so convincing, it can jumpstart your imagination and spin you towards all sorts of evidence. Fresh eyes for seeing other objects from the same period. And no longer are these just bits and pieces in a display, but you begin to fit them into a picture of the past, which is beginning to form in your mind. It is extraordinary how custom-made objects based upon evidence of what might have been in use hundreds of years ago can give such a strong sense of being in touch with history. So I do have to keep reminding myself that this is just another version of how things might have been, and that for children who visit reconstructions like this is just one more way of approaching evidence about the past. That's why it is important to allow them to speculate about how things might have been, to know about a range of evidence, and to investigate it from different angles. Of course, the timelines, dates and events are important, but so is the possibility of interpretation, a chance to try out things and reflect upon what might have happened in the past. If you've got that background of interest and a set of unanswered questions to investigate, then for children, visiting a monument like Alford Castle becomes an inquiry into the evidence. Imagine yourself as a medieval maintenance engineer and you start thinking more carefully about ways the stonework is built.
No? Yeah. There's a bit of wall over there, that's not very strong.
Oh, that bit there.
Discuss storage schemes needed in preparation for a siege, and you begin to reflect on the way rooms in the castle might have been used.
Right, gather around the well. This is the most important thing in the castle. We've got to make sure this is at all times full. We must move this flower.
And it's often by asking and answering questions that you build a much more informed way of thinking about historical evidence.
You go and make sure they stack them properly.
But no one would pretend that approaching the past through a range of evidence is the easiest route to follow. And of course, looking at books, picking up on the evidence in museum displays, even trawling through authentic documents or listening to the stories told by historians, can, if you're not careful, seem to make things more confusing. But does that matter? Is it a reason for not showing children historical feature films and the whole range of distorted evidence that follows? Or should we be more prepared to tolerate the contradictions they'll find? In the end, I suppose, it is important to recognise that different sources of evidence will give us more than one interpretation of the past, and that questioning and comparing alternative versions is central to our understanding of history.
Looking for the way to brighter shopping days. Everybody has to visit our store.
There's never been a better time to barter for a bargain at your local Centurion stores. Choose from our huge selection of fine tableware, specially imported from Gaul. Everything must go, and it's all half price at the Centurion Stores Monster Sale.
Living today, you know what you want. Try it our way. Shopping today.
Now on.
Imagine an olive oil silky smooth, so versatile it can be used for cooking, cleansing and lighting. An oil rich in the natural ingredients of the Mediterranean. Flaminius olive oil, the oil of life.
Come and relax at the Strigil Bathhouse. You can unwind with an invigorating massage from our fully trained slaves. Order from a range of hot and cold snacks or catch up on some exercise. But don't leave without taking a soak in one of our heated baths. All our rooms feature cutting-edge, hyper-cost heating technology, direct from Rome. At the Strigil Bathhouse, we guarantee you'll discover that leisure has never been so much pleasure.
Well, one more glimpse of the past. Facts about everyday Roman life wrapped up and presented in a far more recognisable form. Hello, I'm Jane Evans. Now, it's a Roman institution featured in one of those spoof adverts that provides the facts and perhaps a little fiction for the second part of According to the Evidence. In this half of the programme, we'll be peering through the steam to see how historians and archaeologists weigh evidence and balance clues before they can even think about putting together an impression of how places and buildings might have looked in the past. The subject under scrutiny? Well, we're dipping a toe in the hot and cold waters of a Roman bathhouse. We pretty well know from excavations that all Roman towns had at least one bathhouse. Admission was cheap, free for children. First you took a cold dip before moving on through warmer rooms to the hot dip and back again to the cold. You might even have taken some exercise outside. Well, we know about the rooms, but does this filmed reconstruction show us what they really look like? Or are there some modern inaccuracies? After all, this is just one interpretation. And of course, you can always stop and rewind the tape to review the evidence that's coming up. Next, we look at some present-day drawings, evidence based upon excavations at a number of Roman sites. The pictures clearly show how the artist thinks each room might have looked, but assuming the walls were pretty much at ground level when they were excavated, how would you know which were the hot rooms, which were the cold, or where the dressing rooms and exercise yard might have been? Let's take a second look around the pictures. And if you want to review the evidence a few more times, use the pause and rewind buttons on your video recorder. But if the rooms in a Roman bathhouse present archaeologists with a problem of interpretation, how much more difficult is it to work out how objects were used? Here's a photograph of a Roman glass flask found at Corbridge. The caption on the mounting says, "This flask was used to carry oil in bathhouses." Really? A pretty confident statement. What was the evidence historians might have found to come to that conclusion? Perhaps time to pause the tape and discuss. Now, glass vases weren't the only objects which came to light at Corbridge. This is a photograph of a gaming board with its dice and counters, all found at the same site. But would you know where to go for evidence of how the game or games were played? What were the rules? And how did you win? Take another look at the board, the dice and the counters and weigh the evidence for yourself. Buildings, objects, and now people. The Romans may have left behind traces of the buildings they constructed, as well as the objects found in archaeological excavations, but they also left many other important sources of evidence. And in particular, pictures, illustrations, and of course the information they wrote down. two genuine accounts of the operation of a Roman bathhouse. One is written by a fan, the other by an objector. If you read one without seeing the other, would you get a biased view of what the bathhouse was like? So, who is telling the truth? Watch both accounts and decide who you believe.
I live over the public baths. You know what that means. Ah, it's sickening. First, there are the strong men doing their exercises and swinging heavy lead weights about with grunts and groans. Next, there are the lazy ones having a cheap massage. I can hear someone's shoulders being slapped. And then there is the sound of a brawler or a thief being arrested. And the man who always loves the sound of his own voice. And what about the ones who always leap into the pool, make a big splash as they hit the water? When you enter the baths, you are received in a large hall with plenty of rooms for servants and bath attendants. Next, there are the locker rooms to undress in. And then you come into a room which is slightly warmed, instead of being met with a fierce hot blast. Next, there is the hot room, and in a room beyond there are 3 hot tubs. When you have bathed, you needn't go back through these rooms. You can go straight into a cold, unheated room.
Life and times in a Roman bathhouse, concluding this look at some of the sources of evidence that help archaeologists put together their interpretations of how things may have been in the past. But of course, any interpretation is just one point of view. That's why history can look out of date as soon as someone discovers fresh evidence. Bye for now.